The billionaire kicked his family out for no reason, and what they said changed everything, the pinnacle of arrogance. Julian Davies, a man whose net worth had recently eclipsed the staggering $15 billion mark, stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass wall of his private study. He looked out over the meticulously manicured lawns of his sprawling suburban estate. It was an architectural marvel, a fortress of steel, concrete and vast expanses of glass that commanded the highest hill in the most exclusive zip code in the state. Everything about the property was engineered for perfection, from the mathematically precise curvature of the driveway to the biometric security systems that hummed silently in the background. Yet, as Julian stared down at the lower terrace, a deep, unexplainable irritation gnawed at the edges of his perfectly ordered mind. Down there, sitting on a stark modern bench that was never meant to be used for actual comfort, were his parents. Elijah and Sarah Davies did not belong in this environment, and the visual clash was jarring to Julian. They were relics of a past he had spent the last decade meticulously erasing. Elijah, a retired high school history teacher who had spent 40 years pacing the worn linoleum floors of underfunded public schools, sat with his hands resting on his knees. He wore a simple, well-ironed light brown blazer and beige trousers. His short white hair caught the afternoon sun, and his posture was rigid, uncomfortable. Next to him sat Sarah, a retired pediatric nurse whose entire life had been defined by gentle empathy and quiet sacrifice. She wore a soft floral dress with a light beige cardigan draped over her shoulders to ward off the aggressive chill of Julian's centrally air-conditioned kingdom. She clutched a medium-sized handbag on her lap as if she were sitting in a waiting room, not the backyard of her own son's home. Julian despised the way they looked in his house. He despised the way they tiptoed across the imported hardwood floors, terrified of scratching them. He despised the polite, almost frightened way they spoke to his domestic staff. Most of all, he despised the silent, heavy judgment he felt radiating from them every time he spoke about his business. Julian had built his empire in the tech sector, ruthlessly acquiring competitors, stripping down their assets, and laying off thousands to maximize profit margins. He was hailed as a visionary by Wall Street and a monster by his critics. To Julian, it was simply the mathematics of success. You were either the predator or the prey, the buyer or the bought. He had accumulated enough wealth to alter the geopolitical landscape. Yet when he looked at his father, he felt like a disappointing teenager again. He turned away from the glass and walked over to his massive oak desk. His personal assistant, David, stood quietly in the corner, holding an encrypted tablet. "Is everything prepared for dinner, David?" Julian asked, his voice a flat, authoritative baritone that left no room for hesitation. "Yes, Mr. Davies," David replied smoothly. "Chef Laurent has prepared the 5-course tasting menu as requested. The 1982 Bordeaux has been decanted. Your parents have been informed that dinner will be served precisely at 7. "Good," Julian muttered, rubbing his temples. "I just need to get through this weekend. They insist on these annual visits, pretending that we still have anything in common. It's exhausting, David. It's like hosting strangers who happen to know my childhood allergies." "They are very proud of you, sir," David offered cautiously. Julian let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "They aren't proud, David. They are intimidated and a little disgusted. My father looks at my company like it's a criminal enterprise. He thinks because I didn't build it with calloused hands and a union pension, it's somehow inherently evil. He spent his life making pennies trying to teach history to kids who didn't care. And he expects me to validate that by acting guilty about my success." Julian straightened his sharp blue business suit, feeling the perfectly tailored fabric settle against his shoulders. He was a man who controlled global markets, who had senators on speed dial, and who could buy and sell entire industries before breakfast. He decided he was done apologizing for it. He was done shrinking himself to fit into the quaint, middle-class moral framework his parents refused to abandon. Tonight, He would establish the hierarchy. He would make them understand that this was his world, and they were merely guests allowed to breathe its filtered air by his grace alone. Down on the terrace, Sarah reached out and placed her hand over Elijah's. Her fingers were weathered from decades of washing hospital linens and holding the hands of sick children. "He looks tired, Eli," Sarah said softly, glancing up at the imposing glass structure of the main house. "There are dark circles under his eyes. I don't think he sleeps." Elijah did not look up. He kept his gaze fixed on the sterile perfection of the lawn. "A man who spends his days taking from others rarely sleeps well, Sarah. The world tells him he's a king, but I look into his eyes and I don't see my son anymore. I see a machine, a very rich, very cold machine." "Don't say that," she whispered, her voice cracking slightly. "He's still our boy. He just lost his way in all this magnitude. We just need to remind him of who he is. We need to be patient." Elijah let out a heavy sigh, his broad shoulders slumping slightly beneath his brown blazer. "I fear patience is not what he needs. He needs a mirror. But in this house, everything is designed to reflect only what he wants to see." The dinner of judgment. The dining room was a cavernous space designed for intimidation rather than dining. A monolithic slab of polished black stone served as the table, capable of seating 20 people. Tonight, it held only 3. Julian sat at the head of the table, bathed in the precise, dim glow of a modern chandelier that looked more like an abstract weapon than a light fixture. Elijah sat to his right, Sarah to his left. The distance between them felt like miles. The silence was deafening, punctuated only by the soft clinking of expensive silverware against bone china. Chef Laurent's creations, intricate, foam-topped morsels that looked more like modern art than food, sat mostly untouched on Elijah and Sarah's plates. "The Wagyu is flown in directly from Kobe," Julian stated, breaking the suffocating silence. He sliced a tiny piece of the meat, not looking up. "You should eat it while it's at the optimal temperature." "It's very nice, Julian," Sarah said politely, taking a minuscule bite to appease him. "Thank you. You really didn't have to go to all this trouble." "It's not trouble, Mother. It's standard. This is how I live," Julian replied, taking a sip of the vintage Bordeaux. Before another word could be spoken, Julian's phone buzzed aggressively against the black stone table. It was a custom alert, reserved only for top-tier emergencies. Julian snatched it up, his demeanor instantly shifting from apathetic host to predatory CEO. He didn't excuse himself. He simply swiped the screen and brought the phone to his ear. "Speak," Julian commanded. He listened for a moment, his jaw tightening. "I don't care what the union says, Marcus. Gut the pension fund and liquidate the manufacturing division by Monday. If they strike, we fire them all and rehire non-union contractors at 60% of the cost. I'm not running a charity. Break them. Do you understand? Break the leadership and the rest will fall in line. Have the legal team draft the termination notices tonight." Julian ended the call and tossed the phone back onto the table. He picked up his fork entirely unbothered, only to find both of his parents staring at him. Sarah's eyes were wide with shock, her mouth slightly open. Elijah had pushed his plate away entirely, his face a mask of quiet fury. "Is there a problem?" Julian asked, arching an eyebrow. "You're destroying people's lives," Elijah said, his voice low and vibrating with a terrifying calmness. "Right there, between bites of your expensive dinner, you just ruined hundreds of families. You just took away their security, their future." Julian rolled his eyes, a gesture dripping with adolescent contempt despite his 36 years. "Oh, please, Dad, save the working-class hero speech. It's business. That manufacturing division was bleeding capital. By cutting the dead weight, I secure the future of the parent company and increase shareholder value. It's economics." "It's cruelty," Elijah corrected, leaning forward, the knuckles of his calloused hands turning white as he gripped the edge of the black stone table. "You used the phrase, break them. You're talking about human beings, Julian. Fathers, mothers, people trying to put food on their tables just like I did for you. And you treat them like numbers on a screen that you can just delete. Because they are numbers on a screen. Julian's voice suddenly echoed through the cavernous room, rising in volume and ferocity. The mask of calm superiority was slipping, revealing the volatile arrogance beneath. Everything is a number. Do you know how the world actually works, old man? It runs on power and capital. The fairy tales you taught me in our cramped, freezing little house don't apply out here in the real world. Julian, please, Sarah pleaded, her voice trembling. Don't speak to your father that way. He loves you. He doesn't love me, Julian snapped, turning his glare onto his mother. He resents me. He's been sitting in my house for 2 days, radiating disapproval because I managed to achieve something he couldn't even dream of. You both sit there, judging my life, judging my money, pretending you're somehow morally superior while eating the food my money bought, sleeping in the bed my money provided. Elijah stood up, slowly, deliberately. The scrape of his chair against the floor sounded like a gunshot in the tense room. He looked down at his son, not with anger anymore, but with a profound, soul-crushing pity. I have never envied your money, Julian, Elijah said, his voice steady and heartbreakingly sad. I pity what you had to trade to get it. You have a $15 billion empire, and you are the poorest man I have ever known. You have no respect, no empathy, and no soul left. You are hollow. The word struck Julian like a physical blow, bypassing his ego and hitting the deep-seated insecurities he had spent his life burying under mountains of cash. His face flushed crimson. A blinding, irrational rage overtook him. He stood up, slamming both palms onto the table. How dare you, Julian hissed, his voice trembling with fury. How dare you come into my home, my kingdom, and speak to me like that? I am Julian Davies. I own the world. I don't need your approval, and I certainly don't need your pathetic, outdated moralizing in my house. Then we will leave, Elijah said simply. He turned to his wife. Come, Sarah. We are no longer welcome here. No, Julian shouted, completely losing control. His ego demanded total submission, and his father's quiet dignity was an intolerable insult. You don't get to dramatically walk out on me. I am kicking you out. You want to take the moral high ground. Take it out on the street. Pack your bags. I want you off my property tonight. I never want to see your judgmental faces in my house again. Sarah gasped, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes. She looked at her son, searching his face for any sign of a joke, any hint of regret, but she found only a stranger, a man consumed by his own grandiosity. Julian, she whispered, a final plea. Get out! Julian roared, pointing toward the massive double doors of the dining room. Get out of my house! Elijah gently placed his hand on the small of Sarah's back, guiding her away from the table. He did not look back at Julian. He simply held his head high, a man of unshakable principle, walking away from a son he no longer recognized. Julian stood alone in the vast, echoing dining room, breathing heavily, convinced in his burning arrogance that he had just won the argument. He had no idea that he had just set fire to the only real wealth he had ever possessed. The streets of regret. They had not left in the dead of night. With a quiet, unyielding dignity that enraged Julian even further, Elijah and Sarah had packed their small amount of belongings and waited in the grand marble foyer until the sun rose. They refused the offer of Julian's private chauffeur. They refused to even drink a glass of water from his kitchen. When the heavy, automated security gates of the estate finally slid open to reveal the pristine, ultra-exclusive neighborhood beyond, they simply walked out. It was a breathtakingly beautiful morning, the kind of ultra-realistic cinematic daytime scene that seemed almost too perfect to be real. The suburban street was flawlessly quiet and clean, bathed in bright natural daylight that made the vibrant colors of the environment pop with a painful clarity. It was a peaceful residential neighborhood, reserved for the apex of society, lined with modern architectural masterpiece houses, impossibly green trees, perfectly trimmed hedges, sweeping immaculate sidewalks, and elegant vintage-inspired street lamps lining the smooth, newly paved road. The sky above was a canvas of clear, bright, endless blue, creating a soft, even daylight that illuminated the entire scene. There were no dark tones here, no dramatic shadows to hide within, and no harsh red lighting. It was a world engineered for flawless comfort and endless privilege. And yet, right in the middle of this manicured paradise, an irreversible tragedy was unfolding in broad daylight. In the foreground of the street, Elijah and Sarah Davies walked side by side, straight down the middle of the road, moving steadily away from the towering gates of their son's compound. The bright morning sun illuminated the strong, heartbreaking emotional expressions etched into their faces. Elijah, a man in his late 70s with short white hair and dark, weathered skin, moved with a rigid, almost mechanical determination. He wore his simple light brown blazer, a crisp white dress shirt, a subtly patterned tie, and sensible beige trousers. In his right hand, he gripped the handle of a single vintage brown suitcase. It was a worn, battered piece of luggage that had seen decades of humble family vacations, entirely out of place in this neighborhood of billionaires. He carried it not just as a piece of luggage, but as a symbol that they had been forced to leave. His posture was intensely tense, his shoulders locked. His expression was a devastating mixture of profound anger and deep, agonizing hurt. His left hand was formed into a tight, trembling, clenched fist at his side as he walked forward, staring straight ahead, refusing to look back at the son who had just discarded them. Next to him, Sarah walked with trembling steps. Her soft grey hair caught the bright daylight, framing a face that was completely shattered by grief. She wore her gentle floral dress, the light beige cardigan pulled tightly around her shoulders as if trying to physically hold herself together. She carried her medium-sized handbag clutched to her chest. Her expression was a portrait of pure shock and unrelenting sadness. Her mouth hung slightly open, her breath catching in soft, ragged gasps, as if she was still physically reacting to the painful, violent argument from the night before. Every ounce of her body language broadcasted severe emotional distress. She leaned slightly toward her husband, seeking the anchor of his presence, as her heart broke into 1,000 irreparable pieces with every step they took down the asphalt. Several steps behind them, a profound and terrible shift was occurring. Julian had followed them out through the gates, driven by a lingering, toxic need to have the last word. He stood in the middle of the pristine street, wearing his impeccably tailored, sharp blue business suit, a crisp white shirt, and a silk tie. But the armor of his wealth had suddenly, violently evaporated, as he watched the distance grow between him and the two people who had given him life. The intoxicating adrenaline of his narcissistic rage completely vanished. It was replaced by a sudden, paralyzing wave of absolute terror. Julian stood frozen in the street, both of his hands flying up to grip the sides of his head in a raw, unscripted display of panic and regret. The gravity of what he had just done crashed down upon him like a collapsing building. He had kicked his parents out. He had banished the only people on earth who loved him unconditionally. His facial expression twisted into a mask of pure shock, overwhelming guilt and breathless desperation as he watched the elderly couple walk away from him. The image was a dramatic storytelling composition, framed with strong depth and perspective. The elderly couple in the foreground was in sharp, vivid focus, their pain undeniably real, while the opulent suburban background softly faded into a shallow depth of field, becoming entirely irrelevant. The $15 billion, the tech empire, the power, the status, none of it mattered in this single, agonizing second. Julian opened his mouth to call out to them, to tell them to stop, to apologize, but his throat had closed completely. He was suffocating on his own arrogance, watching his father's clenched fist and his mother's weeping face disappear down the bright, sunny street, realizing too late that he had just crossed a line from which there could be no return. The void of wealth, the heavy steel gates of the estate slid shut with a definitive metallic thud, sealing Julian back inside his fortress. For the first time in his life, the sprawling 50,000-square-foot mansion did not feel like a monument to his greatness. It felt like a mausoleum. Julian walked slowly back up the mathematically perfect curvature of the driveway, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. He entered the grand foyer. The air inside was climate-controlled to the exact degree of human comfort, yet Julian felt freezing cold. He walked through the echoing, cavernous hallways of his home. Every surface was polished to a mirror shine, every piece of art curated by world-renowned experts, every piece of furniture an antique worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. But the silence in the house was absolutely deafening. It pressed against his eardrums, a heavy, suffocating vacuum. He went straight to his private study, the nerve center of his global operations. He sat down in his Italian leather executive chair and stared at the array of glowing monitors displaying real-time stock tickers, global market fluctuations, and the aggressive upward trajectory of his own company's valuation. Just 12 hours ago, these numbers had been his lifeblood. They had been the undeniable proof of his superiority. Now, they were just meaningless pixels blinking in the dark. He tried to force himself into the familiar rhythm of his ruthless routine. He pulled up the documents for the manufacturing division liquidation he had ordered the night before, the very catalyst that had ignited the final fatal argument with his father. He looked at the spreadsheets, at the thousands of employee ID numbers that were scheduled to be terminated by Monday morning. He tried to summon the cold, calculating thrill of maximizing his profit margins, but as he looked at the screen, the numbers blurred. All he could see was his father's calloused hand, clenched into a tight, trembling fist. All he could hear was his mother's ragged, gasping breath as she walked away in her floral dress. "Damn it," Julian whispered, his voice cracking in the empty room. He slammed his fist onto the massive oak desk, the sound echoing sharply off the glass walls. "Damn it!" He snatched up his phone and hit a speed dial button. It was answered on the first ring. "Mr. Davies?" David Reed's voice came through, smooth and professional as always. "David, get in here. Now!" Julian barked, the desperation in his voice entirely failing to mask itself as authority. Less than 60 seconds later, the oak doors to the study swung open, and David stepped inside, carrying his encrypted tablet. He took one look at Julian. The pale skin, the wide, panicked eyes, the slightly disheveled blue suit, and paused. David had worked for Julian for 6 years. He had seen the billionaire furious. He had seen him ruthless, and he had seen him calculating. He had never seen him terrified. "Sir, is everything all right?" David asked cautiously. "My parents left," Julian said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. We had an altercation. I lost my temper. They walked out the front gates about 20 minutes ago." David blinked, processing the information. "Shall I have the security team track their car, sir?" "They didn't take a car, David. They walked," Julian yelled, leaping out of his chair and pacing the length of the room like a caged animal. "They walked out carrying a single suitcase. They're in their 70s. I need you to find them immediately." "Right away, sir. I will deploy the private security detail to scour the neighborhood and the surrounding thoroughfares. If they are on foot, they cannot have gone far." "And when you find them," Julian continued, his mind racing to apply his usual solutions to this entirely new problem, "I want you to fix it. Tell them I overreacted. Book them the presidential suite at the Four Seasons downtown. Hire a private medical staff to check their vitals. Buy them a new car, whatever they want. Tell them I'll set up a foundation in their name with a $50 million endowment. Just get them off the street and fix it." David nodded quickly, tapping rapidly on his tablet. "Consider it done, Mr. Davies. I will handle it personally." Julian sank back into his chair, rubbing his temples as a violent headache began to bloom behind his eyes. He exhaled a long, shaky breath, convincing himself that money would bridge the gap. Money had always bridged the gap. He could buy a country's debt. He could certainly buy his way out of a family argument. He just needed to flood the zone with capital. But 3 agonizing hours later, David walked back into the study. His normally composed face was tight with stress. He did not look at the tablet in his hands. He looked directly at Julian. "Well," Julian demanded, leaning forward, "are they at the hotel? Are they safe?" David cleared his throat. "Sir, we can't find them." Julian froze. "What do you mean you can't find them? I pay a security firm $3 million a year to have satellite access and facial recognition software. What do you mean you can't find 2 elderly people carrying a vintage suitcase?" "They walked to the edge of the neighborhood and boarded a public transit bus, sir," David explained, keeping his voice carefully neutral. "We tracked the bus route, but they disembarked at a busy transit hub. From there, they vanished. I immediately contacted their bank to monitor their credit and debit cards to track their location. But, sir, they haven't used them. They withdrew $2,000 in cash from an ATM near the transit hub, and the accounts have been dormant since." Julian's heart hammered against his ribs. "Call their cell phones. Trace the GPS." "I tried, Mr. Davies," David said softly. "The calls go straight to automated carrier messages. They haven't just turned their phones off. They have completely deactivated their accounts. The numbers are dead." Julian stared at his assistant, the blood draining from his face. The reality of the situation was settling over him like a heavy, suffocating blanket of ice. Elijah and Sarah hadn't just stormed out to teach him a lesson. They hadn't gone to a hotel to wait for his inevitable apology. They had intentionally, methodically severed all ties. They had disappeared into the vast, invisible world of ordinary people, a world where Julian's billions held no immediate power, where his tracking algorithms and corporate black cards were utterly useless. "Keep looking," Julian whispered, his voice hollow and weak. "Hire private investigators. Bribe the transit authorities. I don't care what it costs, David. Find them." "Yes, sir," David replied, turning to leave the room. As the heavy oak doors closed behind his assistant, Julian was left entirely alone in his $15 billion fortress. He looked around at the magnificent empty space. He had spent his entire adult life accumulating absolute power, ensuring that he would never be vulnerable, never be dependent, and never be at the mercy of anyone else. But as he sat in the agonizing silence, haunted by the phantom image of his father's clenched fist, Julian Davies realized the most terrifying truth of all. He was the most powerful man in the city, but without his family, he had absolutely nothing. The void of his wealth had swallowed him whole, and there was no amount of money on earth that could buy back the morning he had just destroyed. The negotiation for forgiveness. It took 3 agonizing weeks and a small fortune in private intelligence gathering to locate them. For a man who could track the global supply chain of microchips down to the square millimeter, the sheer difficulty of finding 2 elderly people who simply wished not to be found was a humiliating, terrifying revelation. They had not left a digital footprint. They had not checked into a hotel, boarded an airplane, or used a credit card. They had effectively vanished into the grinding machinery of the working class, a world Julian had spent his entire adult life trying to orbit far above. When David finally walked into Julian's meticulously sterile office and placed a single printed photograph on the desk, Julian felt his breath catch in his throat. The photograph showed a weathered 3-story brick apartment building in a heavily industrialized, forgotten district of a neighboring city. The fire escapes were rusted, the concrete steps leading up to the front entrance were cracked and uneven, and a persistent grey drizzle seemed to hang over the neighborhood like a shroud. Apartment 3B, sir, David said quietly, his voice devoid of its usual crisp corporate edge. They signed a month-to-month lease under your mother's maiden name. They paid the deposit in cash. It's a very rough neighborhood, Mr. Davies. The crime statistics are severely elevated. Julian did not say a word. He stood up, buttoned his $5,000 bespoke suit jacket, and walked out of the room. 2 hours later, a convoy of 3 sleek, blacked-out luxury SUVs pulled up to the curb of the crumbling apartment building. The vehicles looked alien, entirely out of place against the backdrop of pawnshops and boarded-up storefronts. Julian stepped out into the freezing rain, flanked by David and 2 of his most ruthless, high-powered corporate fixers, men who negotiated multi-billion-dollar mergers before lunch. One of the lawyers carried a thick, bound leather portfolio. Julian was operating under the only protocol he understood: overwhelming force, absolute leverage, and unlimited capital. He was going to buy his family back. He ignored the stares of the locals as he walked up the cracked concrete steps and entered the dimly lit hallway. The air inside smelled of stale tobacco smoke, damp plaster, and boiled cabbage. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered violently, casting erratic shadows against the peeling yellow wallpaper. Julian's jaw clenched. The thought of his mother, a woman who deserved the finest comforts the world had to offer, sleeping in a place like this made him physically nauseous. He climbed the narrow, creaking wooden stairs to the 3rd floor, his pulse hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He stopped in front of the door marked 3B. The paint was chipped, and the brass deadbolt looked flimsy, offering no real protection. Julian raised his fist and knocked, a sharp, authoritative rap that echoed down the dismal corridor. A moment later, the locks clicked and the door swung open. Elijah Davies stood in the doorway. He was wearing a faded grey sweater and worn trousers. The 3 weeks had aged him dramatically. The lines around his eyes were deeper, and his broad shoulders seemed to carry an invisible, crushing weight. But his eyes, the same dark, perceptive eyes that had stared down unruly teenagers for 40 years, were as sharp and unyielding as steel. He looked past Julian, briefly noting the looming presence of the lawyers and the security personnel in the narrow hallway, before his gaze settled back on his son. There was no surprise in his expression, only a profound, devastating weariness. "Elijah," Julian started, his voice uncharacteristically tight. He swallowed hard, trying to project the aura of control that usually commanded boardrooms. "I'm coming inside." Elijah did not move to block him, but he did not step aside to welcome him either. He simply left the door open and turned, walking back into the cramped, dimly lit living room. Julian stepped across the threshold, and the sheer modesty of the apartment hit him like a physical blow. The furniture was second-hand, mismatched and worn. A small, ancient television sat on a milk crate in the corner. The kitchen was little more than a hot plate and a miniature refrigerator humming loudly against a grease-stained wall. Sitting at a small, wobbly laminate dining table was Sarah. She wore the same beige cardigan she had worn the morning he kicked them out. She was holding a mug of tea, and when she looked up and saw Julian, her eyes instantly filled with tears. "Mom!" Julian choked out, the corporate armor cracking instantly. He took a step toward her, but Elijah's voice stopped him dead in his tracks. "State your business, Julian," Elijah said coldly, standing between his son and his wife. "You have lawyers with you. You clearly didn't come for a family reunion. You came to negotiate a contract, so present your terms." Julian flinched. The coldness in his father's voice was far worse than the screaming match they had in the mansion. He turned slightly, gesturing sharply to the lawyer holding the leather portfolio. The lawyer stepped forward, opened the portfolio, and placed a stack of thick watermarked documents onto the cheap laminate table right next to Sarah's tea. "I bought you a house," Julian said rapidly, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "An estate in Oak Brook. It's fully staffed, cooks, security, medical personnel on call 24/7. The deed is in your name, free and clear. Furthermore, I have established an irrevocable trust in both of your names, endowed with $50 million. It's yours. No strings attached, no oversight from me. You can give it to charity, you can burn it, I don't care. I'm sorry, I lost my temper. It was a mistake. Now let my security team pack your things, and let's get you out of this squalor. He waited for the relief. He waited for the shock, the gratitude, the tears of reconciliation. He waited for the power of his wealth to bridge the terrible chasm he had created. Instead, Elijah looked down at the documents, then back up at Julian. He didn't even reach out to touch the leather binder. "You still don't understand," Elijah said, his voice dropping to a low, quiet register that resonated with absolute finality. "You honestly believe that every relationship in your life is a transaction. You think you can put a price tag on human dignity. You think you can buy absolution for the cruelty in your heart." "Dad, I'm apologizing." Julian raised his voice, frustration bleeding through his desperation. "I am giving you everything. I'm giving you $50 million and a mansion. What more do you want from me?" "We wanted our son," Sarah whispered. The sound of her voice, frail and trembling, shattered the tension in the room. She stood up slowly, her hands shaking as she pulled her cardigan tighter around herself. She looked at Julian with an expression of pure, unadulterated heartbreak. "We didn't want a mansion, sweetheart. We didn't want $50 million. We just wanted the boy who used to help his father fix the old station wagon. We wanted the boy who had a kind heart. But he doesn't live inside you anymore. You traded him away." "Mom, please!" Julian begged, feeling the ground entirely drop out from beneath him. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a gold-plated pen, offering it toward them. "Just sign the papers. Just let me take care of you. I can't let you live like this." Elijah picked up the heavy leather portfolio. For a fleeting, desperate second, Julian thought his father was going to open it. Instead, Elijah stepped forward and pressed the binder firmly back into Julian's chest, forcing him to take it. "We are not living in squalor, Julian," Elijah said, his eyes locking onto his son's with a fierce, unwavering pride. "We are living in peace, a peace you clearly do not possess, and a peace your money cannot buy. Take your contracts, take your lawyers. And do not come back to this door until you figure out what it actually means to be a human being." Elijah placed his hand on the door, holding it open. The invitation to leave was absolute. Julian stood frozen, clutching the useless documents to his chest. He looked at his mother, begging silently with his eyes for a reprieve, but Sarah only looked away, wiping a tear from her cheek as she turned back to the tiny kitchen. Stripped of his power, his leverage utterly, completely neutralized, the billionaire had no choice but to turn around and walk out into the dismal, flickering hallway. When the cheap wooden door clicked shut behind him, the sound was louder than a bomb going off. Julian Davies stood in the filthy corridor, surrounded by his high-priced lawyers and his billions of dollars, and realized for the very first time in his life that he was entirely, permanently bankrupt. The final blow. The months that followed were a purgatory of Julian's own making. The seasons shifted from a miserable wet autumn into a brutally cold, unforgiving winter, perfectly mirroring the sterile, frozen landscape of his internal world. He returned to his glass and steel fortress on the hill, but the house was no longer a sanctuary. It was a museum dedicated to his greatest failure. In a desperate, flailing attempt to appease his own screaming conscience, Julian began to alter his business practices. The ruthless edge that had defined his career was suddenly blunted. He halted the liquidation of the manufacturing division, saving thousands of jobs, much to the furious bewilderment of his board of directors. He authorized massive, anonymous donations to underfunded public school districts in the city, a silent tribute to his father's lifetime of teaching. He poured hundreds of millions into pediatric wings at children's hospitals, honoring his mother's nursing career. The media hailed it as a miraculous change of heart, dubbing him the new golden boy of tech philanthropy. But it all felt completely, agonizingly performative. It felt hollow because the only two people whose approval he desperately craved refused to witness it. Every letter he sent to the rundown apartment was returned unopened, marked "Return to Sender" in his father's precise, neat handwriting. Every attempt David made to bridge the gap through intermediaries was met with a polite but unbreakable wall of silence. Julian was screaming his apologies to the world through his checkbook, but the silence from apartment 3B was deafening. It happened on a Tuesday in early February. The sky outside the towering windows of his corporate headquarters was a bruised, heavy grey, threatening snow. Julian was sitting at the head of a massive mahogany conference table, surrounded by 20 of his top executives. They were discussing a hostile takeover of a European software firm, presenting projections and profit margins. Julian was staring blankly at the glass, completely dissociated from the drone of corporate strategy, watching the first few flakes of snow begin to fall against the window pane. Suddenly, a sharp, distinct ring cut through the murmur of the boardroom. It was Julian's private mobile phone, a device with a heavily encrypted number known only to David, his head of security, and a very small, select handful of personal contacts from his past. He never received calls on this phone during business hours. The room fell instantly silent as Julian pulled the phone from his pocket. He looked at the caller ID. The name flashed on the screen, sending a sudden, violent spike of adrenaline straight through his heart. Dr. Evelyn Hayes. Evelyn was the old family physician. She had known the Davies family for 3 decades. She had stitched up Julian's knee when he fell off his bike at age 10, and she had been his parents' primary care doctor ever since. She was one of the few ties to his past that his parents had maintained after moving to the city. Julian's hand shook slightly as he pressed the button to answer. He didn't excuse himself from the room. He simply brought the phone to his ear, his eyes wide and fixed on nothing. "Evelyn?" Julian breathed, his voice cracking instantly. "Julian? Dr. I?" Hayes's voice came through the speaker. It was not the warm, familiar tone he remembered from his childhood. It was tight, clinical, and laced with a deep, heavy sorrow. "I need you to listen to me very carefully. You need to come to St. Jude's Medical Center immediately. I'm down in the emergency cardiac wing." The blood drained from Julian's face so fast he felt dizzy. The executives around the table watched in stunned silence as the billionaire, a man known for his unshakable composure, physically visibly wilted in his chair. "Who?" Julian choked out, the single word scraping against his throat like broken glass. "Evelyn, who is it? Is it my mother?" "It's your father, Julian," Dr. Hayes replied, her voice remaining terrifyingly steady. "He collapsed at the grocery store about an hour ago. He has suffered a massive, catastrophic myocardial infarction, a severe heart attack. The paramedics managed to resuscitate him in the ambulance, but, Julian, it's bad. The damage to the ventricular wall is extensive." Julian shot out of his chair, knocking it backward onto the thick carpet. He began to pace frantically, the billionaire instinct to solve problems with infinite resources kicking in with violent force. Okay, Julian said rapidly, his mind racing. "I'm sending my private medevac helicopter right now. I'm calling the Mayo Clinic. I will fly in the top cardiovascular surgeons from Switzerland. Evelyn, I'll buy the entire wing of the hospital if I have to. Put him on an ECMO machine, whatever it takes. Just keep him stable until my team gets there." "Julian, stop!" Dr. Hayes barked, her voice suddenly cutting through his manic rambling with the sharp, authoritative edge of a medical professional dealing with a grieving relative. "Stop it. Put the checkbook away. You cannot buy your way out of this one. You cannot negotiate with mortality." Julian froze, staring out the window at the falling snow, his breathing ragged and shallow. "He is in the ICU, Julian." Dr. Hayes continued, her voice softening slightly, returning to the gentle tone of the family friend she was. His body has been under an immense amount of chronic stress for the past year. His blood pressure has been dangerously high, and his heart simply gave out. He is unconscious, and his organs are beginning to fail. We are doing everything medically possible, but you need to understand the reality of this situation. The Swiss surgeons cannot save him. The money cannot save him. Evelyn, please, Julian whispered, tears finally breaking free and tracking hot paths down his face, completely ignoring the 20 executives staring at him in shock. It's not about money right now, Julian, she said softly. It's about time. You have very little of it left. Your mother is here, and she is asking for you. Get on your helicopter and get to this hospital, now. The line went dead. Julian dropped the phone onto the mahogany table. He didn't look at his board of directors. He didn't issue any orders. He simply turned and ran out of the room. 20 minutes later, Julian was strapped into the leather seat of his private Sikorsky helicopter, soaring over the sprawling, gridlocked city towards St. Jude's Medical Center. The snow was falling harder now, whipping against the windshield in chaotic, blinding streaks. Julian stared down at the millions of tiny cars, the endless concrete arteries of the city, the empire of commerce that he had conquered and ruled with absolute authority. But as the hospital's red landing pad lights came into view through the storm, the devastating, crushing reality of his existence finally settled heavily upon his shoulders. He possessed a fortune of $15 billion. He could influence elections, bankrupt sovereign nations, and alter the course of human technology. But up here in the freezing sky, looking down at the hospital where his father's heart was failing, Julian Davies realized he was completely, utterly powerless. He was about to face the final, ultimate blow, and all the wealth in the world could not buy him a single extra heartbeat for the man he had banished. The words that changed everything. The Sikorsky helicopter touched down on the reinforced concrete of the hospital's roof with a heavy mechanical thud that reverberated up through Julian's spine. The storm had intensified, whipping freezing rain and snow across the glaring red emergency lights of the landing pad. Julian did not wait for his security detail to secure the perimeter, nor did he wait for the pilot to signal the all clear. He unbuckled his harness with trembling, frantic hands, shoved the heavy sliding door open, and stepped out into the biting winter crosswind. His customized $5,000 bespoke suit was instantly soaked, the fabric clinging to his shivering frame as he sprinted toward the metal stairwell access door. He moved with the chaotic, single-minded desperation of a man watching his empire burn to the ground. He burst through the roof access doors, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the industrial linoleum of the top-floor corridor. "Where is the ICU? Where is the cardiac wing?" Julian roared at a terrified nursing assistant who had just stepped out of an elevator. He didn't wait for her to answer. He shoved past her, his eyes scanning the sterile, endlessly repeating signs overhead. He practically threw himself down 2 flights of stairs, bypassing the slow elevators, his lungs burning with the icy air he had swallowed on the roof. He finally burst through double doors marked Intensive Care Unit. Authorized personnel only. The environment here was completely different from the rest of the hospital. It was a hushed, pressurized vacuum of beeping monitors, hushed voices, and the heavy, metallic scent of antiseptic and fear. Julian ran toward the central nurses' station, his face pale, his hair plastered to his forehead by the freezing rain. "Elijah Davies. I am Julian Davies. Where is my father? I have a medical team en route from Geneva. I need his chart. I need—" "Julian." The voice cut through his manic, booming demands. It was quiet, incredibly soft, and yet it carried a finality that struck him like a physical blow to the sternum. Julian turned slowly. Standing outside room 412 was Dr. Evelyn Hayes. She was still wearing her white coat, a stethoscope draped loosely around her neck. Her posture was slumped, the professional armor completely stripped away, leaving only the profound sorrow of a woman who had just lost a dear friend. She was not looking at him with the urgency of a doctor trying to save a patient. She was looking at him with the devastating pity of someone who had nothing left to offer. "No," Julian whispered, the single syllable escaping his lips as a ragged, pathetic gasp. "No, Evelyn, you said you were stabilizing him. You said he was on life support." Dr. Hayes slowly shook her head, tears brimming in her weary eyes. "We tried, Julian. We gave him every milligram of epinephrine. We shocked his heart. But the tissue was just too damaged. The stress, the hypertension, his heart ruptured. He coded 10 minutes before your helicopter landed. I am so terribly sorry, Julian. He's gone." The floor beneath Julian's feet seemed to completely vaporize. His knees buckled, hitting the polished linoleum with a heavy, sickening thud. He didn't feel the pain. He didn't feel the cold dampness of his suit. He could only hear a high-pitched, deafening ringing in his ears, a frequency of pure, unadulterated horror. He, Julian Davies, the billionaire who controlled global markets, who could buy governments and dictate the future of human technology, was kneeling on a hospital floor, utterly powerless. His money had meant absolutely nothing. Time had expired, and he couldn't buy a single second back. "My mother!" Julian choked out, looking up at Dr. Hayes through a blinding veil of tears. "Where is she?" "She is in there with him," Dr. Hayes said softly, gesturing to the closed door of room 412. "She wants to speak with you." Julian dragged himself up from the floor. His legs felt like lead, his entire body trembling violently. He placed his hand on the cold aluminum handle of the door and pushed it open. The room was dimly lit, the harsh fluorescent overhead switched off. In the center of the room lay the hospital bed, and upon it was Elijah. He looked incredibly small, the tubes and wires already removed from his body. His face was relaxed, the deep lines of stress and anger finally smoothed away by the ultimate quiet, but his skin had taken on the unmistakable ashen hue of the deceased. Sitting in a plastic chair right beside the bed was Sarah. She was holding Elijah's lifeless, calloused hand between both of hers, pressing it gently against her cheek. She did not cry. She had no tears left. Her face was a mask of absolute hollow devastation. "Mom!" Julian sobbed, stumbling forward, falling to his knees beside her chair. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I brought the helicopter. I was going to fly him out. I was going to buy the best doctors in the world. I was going to fix this. I swear to God, I was going to fix it all." Sarah slowly turned her head and looked down at her son. Her eyes, normally so full of gentle empathy, were as cold and empty as the winter sky outside. She did not reach out to touch him. She did not stroke his hair or offer the maternal comfort he was begging for. "You still don't understand, do you, Julian?" Sarah whispered, her voice rasping, dry as dust. "Even now, looking at your father's dead body, you are talking about helicopters and buying doctors. You are still trying to run a transaction. No, Mom, Quiet," she commanded, the sheer authority in her frail voice silencing the billionaire instantly. "You will listen to me now. You will listen to the truth that you have been hiding from for 10 years. She gently placed Elijah's hand back onto his chest and turned her body fully toward Julian. "When you kicked us out of your house that night," Sarah began, her voice steadying into a rhythmic crushing cadence, "you thought you were punishing us. You thought we walked down that street carrying a suitcase full of regret, wishing we had just stayed quiet and accepted your money. But you were wrong." Julian stared up at her, tears streaming down his face, completely paralyzed by the raw, unvarnished truth radiating from his mother. "The reason we left, the reason we never answered your letters, the reason we refused your millions and your mansions, was not out of stubbornness. It was out of grief," Sarah said, leaning slightly closer, her eyes boring directly into his soul. "We didn't lose our son that night in your dining room, Julian. We realized we had lost him years ago. We walked out of those gates because sitting in that house, watching you destroy lives with a stroke of a pen, watching you treat human beings like garbage to inflate your bank account, we realized we were sitting across from a dead man. Julian gasped, as if he had been physically stabbed. "You kicked us out for no reason, Julian," Sarah continued, delivering the words that would fracture his mind permanently. "But what you didn't know was that we were already leaving. That suitcase your father carried, it didn't have our clothes in it. It had your childhood photo albums. It had the clay handprint you made in kindergarten. It had the letters you wrote to us when you were a boy who actually had a heart. We took the only things of value in that entire $50 million compound, and we left the trash behind. We left you behind." "Mom, please, I can change," Julian begged, his forehead resting against the edge of his father's hospital bed. "I gave the money to the schools. I stopped the layoffs. I'm trying to be better, please." "You are a billionaire, Julian," Sarah whispered, delivering the final fatal blow. "But you are the most impoverished, destitute human being I have ever known. You traded your soul, your empathy, and your family for numbers on a screen. And now my husband is dead because his heart broke watching the monster his son had become. Your money didn't buy you the world, Julian. It just bought you a very expensive, very lonely cage, and now you will have to live in it for the rest of your life." Sarah stood up, picking up her worn handbag. She didn't look at Julian again. She leaned down, kissed her husband's cold forehead one last time, and walked out of the hospital room, leaving the billionaire entirely alone in the dark with the corpse of the man he could never apologize to. Julian stayed on his knees, his forehead pressed against the cold metal railing of the bed. The words echoed in his skull, tearing down the final pillars of his massive ego. "We took the only things of value. We left the trash behind." He screamed, a raw, primal sound of absolute agony that tore through his vocal cords, a sound that no amount of money, power, or influence could ever silence. He had won the world, and he had lost absolutely everything. The price of absolution. It had been exactly 1 year to the day. The weather was a cruel, mocking replication of the past. It was an ultra-realistic, cinematic daytime scene on a quiet, clean suburban street. The bright natural daylight bathed the neighborhood in vibrant, saturated colors. The modern architectural houses stood as silent monuments to extreme wealth, surrounded by impossibly green trees, perfectly trimmed hedges, and sweeping, immaculate sidewalks. Elegant, vintage-inspired street lamps lined the smooth asphalt. The sky above was a brilliant, unblemished blue, creating a soft, even daylight that eliminated any dark tones or dramatic shadows. It was a flawless, peaceful residential paradise. Julian Davies sat alone on the concrete curb, right in the middle of the street. He was not wearing a sharp blue business suit. He wore a simple, unbranded grey sweater and faded denim jeans. His face had changed drastically over the past 365 days. The arrogance, the sharp, predatory edge of the tech billionaire was completely gone. In its place was a heavy, permanent exhaustion. The dark circles under his eyes were deeply bruised into his skin, and his shoulders were permanently slumped, bearing an invisible, crushing weight that no surgical intervention or luxury spa retreat could ever alleviate. To the outside world, Julian Davies was a saint. Following the death of his father, he had systematically dismantled his empire. He had stepped down as CEO of his conglomerate, handing control over to a board of directors bound by a strict, unbreakable charter of ethical labor practices. He had taken his $15 billion fortune and liquidated nearly all of it. Billions had been poured into underfunded public education systems across the country in the name of Elijah Davies. Billions more had established a global network of free pediatric clinics in the name of Sarah Davies. He had kept only a fraction of a percent of his wealth, enough to maintain the massive, sprawling suburban estate that sat just a few hundred yards behind him. He kept the house not out of vanity, but as a penitentiary. It was his prison. Julian stared down the length of the pristine street. He was looking at the exact spot where his parents had walked away from him. He could almost see the phantom images superimposed over the bright asphalt. His father's clenched fist, his rigid posture, the vintage brown suitcase, his mother's floral dress, her shocked, gasping expression of pure heartbreak. Resting on the concrete curb right next to Julian was that very same vintage brown suitcase. Following Elijah's funeral, a quiet, modest affair that Julian was barred from attending by his mother's legal injunction, Sarah had moved into an assisted living facility funded by her own pension. She refused to take a single dime of Julian's remaining money. Before she moved, she had David Reed deliver the suitcase back to the mansion. She included no note. The message was already perfectly clear. Julian slowly reached out and unlatched the rusted brass clasps of the old suitcase. The hinges creaked softly in the quiet suburban air. Inside, there were no clothes. Just as Sarah had told him in the hospital room, it was a time capsule of a dead boy. Julian reached inside and pulled out a faded, dog-eared photograph. It showed a 10-year-old Julian, his face smeared with engine grease, laughing uncontrollably as his father, a much younger Elijah with dark hair, hoisted him up onto the hood of an old, beat-up station wagon. He pulled out a piece of construction paper covered in dried, cracked macaroni, spelling out, "To the best dad in the universe." Julian sat on the curb of the most exclusive street in the country, holding the macaroni art in his trembling hands, and wept. The tears were silent, hot, and utterly useless. He had done everything society dictated a repentant man should do. He had given away the money. He had changed the lives of millions of strangers. The press called him a hero. But Julian knew the devastating truth. It wasn't absolution, it was just a different kind of transaction. He was trying to buy forgiveness from the universe because the one person who needed to grant it was buried 6 feet under the earth. And the other person looked at him like he was a stranger. He placed the photograph and the macaroni art carefully back into the suitcase and closed the lid, resting his hand flat against the worn leather. He looked around at the towering mansions, the perfectly manicured lawns, the absolute sterile silence of his environment. He had spent his entire life running away from the cramped, freezing little house he grew up in, desperate to conquer this bright, flawless world. He had believed the lie that capital equated to value, that power equated to respect, and that money could insulate him from the consequences of his own cruelty. But as Julian sat on the curb, the bright natural daylight warming his skin, he realized the ultimate tragedy of his existence. He was a man who could still write a check for $50 million without blinking, yet he was fundamentally, irreversibly impoverished. He stared down the empty street, visualizing the exact moment they crossed the property line. He remembered standing in the road, his hands on his head in panic, watching them disappear. If he could trade every single penny he had ever earned, every drop of influence he had ever wielded, to rewind time to that exact morning, to run down the street, fall to his knees, and simply apologize before they got on that bus, he would do it in a heartbeat. But the universe did not accept billions in exchange for seconds. Julian Davies slowly stood up. He picked up the heavy, vintage brown suitcase by its handle. He turned his back on the bright open street and began the long, agonizing walk back up the perfectly curved driveway toward the massive, echoing glass fortress where he would spend the rest of his life, entirely alone, paying the terrible price of his own arrogance.